Hello everybody and welcome to part 14 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. You join us in orbit above Juno's moon Ike with our interplanetary craft, the Ptolemy. Last time out we hoovered up as much science as we could whilst in orbit before we headed down to the surface, Kerbin becoming the first Kerbal to set foot on this grey, rocky, lifeless planetoid. Yeah, it really is a dull planet. I mean, it's not just the colour, although there is a dark splotch on it just to liven things up a bit. No, I think it's procedurally generated terrain, which means there's no real points of interest on it whatsoever. Last time I described it as a harder to land on version of Kerbin's moon. I think I'd change that now to a significantly less interesting and harder to land on version of Kerbin's moon. Aesthetics aside though, the science has been bountiful. It doesn't take us much fuel to get down to the surface and then back into orbit again, and at 240 science just for a surface sample, I don't think we're quite finished with this little moon just yet. So another trip down to the surface is in order then, but first of all I just want to take care of something that's been kind of bugging me all the way through this mission. So we get Bargel out and she is going to go and repack those parachutes which have been in their used and hence useless state since we last landed on Juno. We don't need them. I mean, we're not landing on a planet with an atmosphere, it's just, it was kind of getting on my nerves a little bit. Oh, and also we can switch off those lights in the lander because I don't know when the hell I turned those on. With that OCD placating housekeeping out of the way, it's time for our Kerbals to prepare properly. We start with juggling the crew around. Kerbin is going to take control of the Ptolemy, whilst Kerbin gets his turn commanding a mission down to the surface. All that's left to do now is to top up the lander's fuel and monopropellant tanks, and we are good to go. We detach the lander from the Ptolemy, we manoeuvre it to the side a little bit, just to make sure it doesn't smash straight into its mothership the moment we light its engines, and then we perform the first of our burns to lower our orbit down to 10 kilometres. We get round the other side of the planet, recircularise our orbit, and now it's time to start looking for a landing spot. Last time we landed in the Midlands biome, this time we're aiming for the lowlands. We do find a suitable site. Just before the big splotch of dark grey on this planet, there's a smaller splotch underneath our orbital path, and that is what we need to aim for. Now, normally on this kind of mission, I would be complaining that we should have burnt earlier. We should have got ourselves a shallower slope down to the landing site, been a bit more fuel efficient, but not in this case. In this case, we have what is, in Ike terms at least, quite a large mountain just before we get to the landing site. So realistically, this is about as early as we could have done it. In fact, the mountain in question does set off our time to impact indicator, which gets me a little worried, so I get the lander pointing upwards just in case we need to do an emergency burn to carry us over it, but it's fine in the end. It was a false alarm, and we get past the mountain, and we get ourselves a good path down to our chosen landing spot. As we make our final approach, the terrain under us is pretty much flat as a pancake. I may have to revise my description of Ike to just a significantly less interesting version of Kerbin's moon. We deploy our landing legs, we retract those solar panels just in case something goes wrong with the landing, but nothing does, and before too long we are once again touching down safe and sound on the surface of Ike. With the ladder extended, Kerbin wastes no time at all getting his boots down onto the grey crystalline soil, and having taken the reports he needs to take, and after a jump for good measure, he plants the flag. Last time we said that we still like Ike. This time the novelty's kind of wearing off, but we still think Ike is alright. Dunfert's comrades come to join him, Johnny stopping to take that valuable surface sample, before they decide it's all a bit bleak, so they're gonna hop back aboard the lander. We crack open the science bay, we take readings from all of our experiments, and with that our second excursion down to the surface of Ike is done. All that remains is for our Kerbals to make their way back into orbit and towards the Ptolemy. The mission was uneventful and routine, much like the surface of the planetoid itself. If you haven't got the message so far, I have been to more exciting places during my time playing KSP. Arriving back at the Ptolemy, we bring the lander into dock with its parent craft before we set about transferring all that science across to the experiment storage containers on board the Ptolemy. Johnny Kerbin then gets out, resets the relevant experiments before transferring the remaining data across from the lander's command pod over to those storage containers. And with all of that done, that is a second mission down to the surface of Ike successfully completed, and I'm quite tempted to call it a day there, just say we're done with Ike for now, but I don't know. In the end, the temptation gets a little bit too much for me. 240 science for a surface sample, 160 science for a seismic scan. Yeah, we're going to go down to the surface again, although we'll go through this one a little quicker because you've seen it all before. And by it, I mean the endless, endless grey. We shuffle the crew about again, Kerbin is back in command, we top up the fuel tanks, and the lander departs the Ptolemy once more. As for which biome we visit on our third and final trip down to the surface, well, it's a bit of a no-brainer really. The mountain that nearly caused us so many problems on our last descent is part of Ike's central mountain range, and I remember flying over it. There's plenty of flat land there that is within the biome, so we are going to head for that. Planning the descent down was quite interesting because our desired landing spot is at such a high elevation. Our periapsis is still above whatever constitutes Ike's sea level as we're on our way down. As we're skimming over the mountain, I spot a likely landing site, so I begin the series of burns that will take us down to the surface. We get the landing legs down, we retract the solar panels, and just as we touch down, I hit the wrong button and we go to the internal view. Never mind, our Kerbals know the drill by now. With the ladder extended, Kerbin makes her way down onto the surface, takes an EVA report, and plants the flag. And I think it's fair to say, we're getting pretty bored of Ike now. Bargel and Johnny join Kerbal on the surface, Johnny grabbing that surface sample of course, before it's time for our Kerbals to climb back aboard the lander and make their way back into space to rendezvous with the Ptolemy. It's a bit weird taking off from this altitude. I mean, I'm going for an orbit with an altitude of 10 kilometres and I'm already at 7.5. I could have done better than that as we're orbiting at 10 kilometres. There is a point on our path that is less than a kilometre below us, which certainly raised a panicked eyebrow the first time I saw that one coming at us. Regardless, before too long we find ourselves arriving back at the Ptolemy and bringing ourselves into dock. We get all that science transferred across to the experiment storage containers, and then Johnny gets out to reset the experiments that need resetting and to transfer the last of that data across. We're not going to be using those experiments anytime soon, but I just like to reset them anyway. Sort of good practice, leave it as you find it, that sort of thing. We top up the monopropellant tank on the lander. We're not going to top up the main fuel tank. We might need that for a burn later, so we'll leave that where it is for the time being. And with all that done, we have finished. We have completed 3 trips down to the surface, and for this mission at least, we are done with Ike. So as the Ptolemy orbits above Ike, it becomes the latest of 3 craft, their missions complete, orbiting their respective destinations, and now we need to think about bringing them home. Now, the Galileo is in a pretty nice orbit around Eve. It can burn from where it is, but the Ptolemy and the Juno, our probe in orbit around Joule, they're going to require a bit more work before they're ready to make their transfer burn when the time comes. More specifically, they're both in orbit around moons, whereas it's going to make the transfer burn back to Kerbin much, much easier to plan if they are in orbit around the parent body instead, so that is what we have to do. We start then with the Ptolemy, whose main engines had once again switched over of their own accord to using monopropellant, but having fixed that, we can now start to plan our transfer manoeuvre to Juno. Now, this is a little bit trickier than this sort of manoeuvre I normally perform, say from Minmus or the Moon back to Kerbin, because this time I'm actually going the right way around the planet. I'm actually travelling with its rotation rather than against it. If I was travelling against the rotation, then I would just get to the opposite side of the Moon to my destination and then just burn prograde until I got a good periapsis around the parent body. But as you can see, this is a little bit more complicated. Nevertheless, we do get ourselves a good manoeuvre planned, we line ourselves up, we wait for the right time, and then we make that short burn to get us into orbit of Juno. I planned the transfer manoeuvre so that I would get a Juno periapsis of 1,000 kilometres, and we're going to circularise at that. Just puts the Ptolemy in a sensible parking orbit until our transfer window arrives. So with our circularisation manoeuvre planned, we time accelerate round to periapsis, we reactivate those engines, and then it's another short burn just to put us in our desired orbit. After all this was done, I did perform a quick plane correction manoeuvre. I'll spare you that detail here, but with all that completed, we are ready and waiting for our transfer window to arrive. With the Ptolemy nicely set up and ready for the return journey, we switch over to Joule's moon Lathe, where our nuclear probe, the Juno, requires similar attention. This time, however, there's an added layer of complication. When I first loaded this up, I noticed we didn't have a direct line of communication with Kerbin, and I thought, well, we must be in the wrong part of our orbit. So we orbited around and Still nothing. Then I checked the map view. Turns out Kerbin is currently on the opposite side of the sun Kerbal, which means we're going to have to do this thing with some restrictions. Without a line of communication to Kerbin, we cannot set up manoeuvre nodes, we do not have full control of the throttle or the direction of the craft. All we can do is point the craft towards one of the 6 basic direction nodes and have the throttle either full open or full closed. To start with then, we are going to finally separate our probe from that booster stage, which has served us so well, but is starting to run low on Delta V. We point this autonomous booster stage retrograde and fire up its engines, guaranteeing its demise either at the hand of Lay's atmosphere or its oceans. The booster stage actually holds up quite well. Only the solar panels are lost to the entry heating. The rest manages to survive to meet a watery end. Back in orbit and with no manoeuvre nodes, we're going to have to eyeball this. I get the probe in what I think is the right direction, and then I fire up that engine. That Candle nuclear engine isn't powerful enough to do this in a single pass, however, so we get round to apoapsis, we circularise our orbit, and we head back round to try again. This time we're successful, we get our transfer to Joule, but our periapsis around the green planet is looking a little low for my tastes. I decide I'm going to go for a parking orbit of 10 kilometres, so we raise that periapsis up to the desired altitude before we travel around the planet and bring our apoapsis down to match. With that done, all 3 of our expeditions are in place and simply waiting for that opportune moment where they can begin their journey home, their journey back to Kerbin, and it's to Kerbin that we now shift our focus because we've got a bit of preparation to do for their arrival. Before we get to any serious preparation, however, we've got a little bit of housekeeping to do. Our orbital science lab is full of science, so once again we need to transmit that back down to Kerbin. This will give us enough science points to pick up a new node on the tech tree, but I'm going to hold off for the time being. There's nothing we need right now, and with what's going to happen next, we might need some new parts at short notice, so I don't want to spend those needlessly and not be able to buy the stuff we need with it. Also, we're not going to be topping up the experiments on board this science lab. We're just going to be letting it work through what it already has, and that's because we've got something else planned. Something new, something big, something shiny. So, as our science lab finishes transmitting the data it has, let's go and see what that's all about. To get that particular ball rolling, we are blasting off here from the KSC with what must be a strong contender for this year's most ridiculous fairing competition. Greyfried Kerman is in the hot seat for this one, and she is joined by Erison and Jeblorf, and she'll have to keep her wits about her because the cargo onto that fairing is very bulky, as you can probably tell, but it's also not that heavy, so it could really upset the aerodynamic balance of this craft. Also, with the cargo being as light as it is, those 6 solid rocket engines are a little bit of overkill. It kind of messes up our ascent profile, and yeah, this isn't the most efficient launch to orbit I've ever done. Apart from that, the ascent goes well, those aerodynamic fears appear to have been ill-founded, and yeah, we get ourselves a good flight up. Where that cargo is as bulky as it is, I did consider going and building an entirely new launch vehicle just to lift this up, but it turned out to be alright in the end. As our Brunel Mark I vehicle reaches space, our crew deploy the fairing and start the process of lifting that cargo off of the stack. Now this is, well, these are the first 3 modules of a new space station. We need to build a new space station. We're going to get this up into a zero inclination orbit, or as close as we can get it to it, at 250 kilometers above Kerbin. Now this space station will take over all of the Aristotle's functions eventually, and it's going to do more besides. We sort of need a larger space station in order to take advantage of some of the later technology that KSP Interstellar introduces. Some of the more exotic technology. We require a more versatile platform in space. For the construction of this station, we're using some of the parts from Near Future Construction, which is one of the other mods I've got installed for this series. Namely the pressurized octo truss parts, which you can see on that 6-way node there in the middle of the assembly. The way we've got this put together at the moment, we've got that command pod on the top, then we've got the 6-way node, and then opposite to the command pod, we've got this little utility module which is going to provide power, radiators, batteries, that sort of thing, just to keep it running until we get proper power sorted. Before we leave this in orbit, we're just going to move that utility module round to a different docking port, just because where it is at the moment is where something else is going to go very shortly. For this, we get Greyfried Kerman into the cupola module, just to keep everything else steady whilst we redock it. With the foundations laid for our new space station, our Kerbals can start to make their way home. They burn straight for re-entry and come down on Kerbin's night side. Yeah, I really should have thought of that and brought them down in the daylight. Never mind. Anyway, as our Kerbals touch down on Kerbin's grasslands, that will bring today's episode to an end. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. We've got a lot to be cracking on with soon. We've got to bring all those craft home. We've got to get the space station into some kind of functioning state. But yeah, that will have to wait for another day. So for now, thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.